Welcome to another episode of Coach's Corner with me, as always, Paul O'Neill. How's it going, Paul?
Doing well, man. Having a great morning so far and excited to have this conversation.
I'm glad you put your glasses on to appear intelligent because we have Mike Tuchscherer on today. So it's like we have to overcompensate for our lack of intelligence by putting glasses on. Probably don't even have a prescription for that, do you?
No, they're prescription. They're
Mhm.
prescription. I like to wear it when I look at screens. There's also a blue light blocker in there. You know,
Nice.
anything I can do to look smarter because I have this mustache. So I mean,
Yeah, you have a lot to make up for.
fighting a losing battle.
Yeah. And so today we have Mike T on. Thanks for coming on the show, Mike. Appreciate your time.
I appreciate you guys inviting me.
Yeah, no, our pleasure. You're someone who has done a lot for the sport of powerlifting in terms of conceptual thinking and kind of moving things in a different direction, in a far better direction in terms of analytical, subjective feedback, all that stuff to continue to progress as lifters. And you're definitely one of the people who set the foundation for powerlifting training and RPE and auto regulation. So it's an honor for us to have you on. I've been following you for quite some time. I remember your old videos you used to do with super training every now and then with Mark Bell and stuff. And then I listened to your guys' podcast and your YouTube and stuff. So appreciate you coming on the show.
Oh, thanks.
So as far as like competitor wise goes, Mike's USAPL competitor, 275 or 265 in USAPL, or a bit of both, right? They just made those when you were competing.
Right. It started off at 275, but I was always pretty light for that weight class. And then 265 meant I had to pay attention a little bit, but you know, not terrible, but yeah.
Yeah. And so lifting in there didn't kind of built your brand through USAPL lifting and your own competitive successes and things like that. But then as you started to step away from being in the highly competitive realm of things with a couple injuries and obviously moving around and stuff like that, you focused a lot on the coaching dynamic and really bringing up the coaching atmosphere. Was that something that you intentionally was planning on doing, or did you just think about it in terms of like, maybe I'm not going to be able to compete at the highest level due to family and I know you had back injuries and stuff like that.
Yeah.
What kind of shifted you towards that educational thing, or was there just a huge gap that you saw that needed to be filled?
Well, I suppose it was something that I always kind of knew would happen. I mean, nobody sets PRs forever. So, you know, I knew early on, like when I first got into, like I kind of happened into coaching in the beginning, but you know, once I kind of realized, hey, I'm doing this now, I'm going to make a career out of coaching. I didn't want to build it on the back of being a good athlete. I mean, that was certainly a help in the beginning. You know, that made a big difference actually in the beginning. But I didn't want it to stay there because I knew I wasn't going to compete forever. You know, I at least wanted the option to not compete and to feel like that wouldn't like hurt my business or something like that. So, and then like not to veer too far into the business side, I guess, but like even coaching, like I know at some point I'll probably want to retire entirely or at least have the option. You know, I don't know if I'm the retirement kind of guy, but but it's nice to have options, right? So that affects strategy, that affects, you know, how you know, whether like just for instance, you know, when the company was new and I was kind of forming things and you're naming all this stuff and it's like, so what are we going to call this company? Like I knew that I didn't want to name it after myself because I didn't want to have to be in front of it all the time.
Yeah.
Maybe at some point I don't want to be in front of it, so I don't want to limit it in that way. So I guess to the point, like I wanted to be able to step away from competing, and that kind of made sense when, like you said, my back wasn't. It's not even that it was terrible. It was limiting performance, but it wasn't affecting me day to day at all. And it was just frustrating to deal with. And at some point, I said, you know what, I'm going to take a break from this. It's not affecting my day to day, and I don't want it to. So started focusing on some other things, and kind of came away figuring out that like the stuff that I really care about in lifting weights isn't necessarily the power lifts. What I care about is I care about getting stronger. I care about like figuring out the puzzle, uh, trying to make improvements. So, if that's the power lifts, great. If it's something else, then I can be happy doing that too.
Yeah, spoken like a true coach, right? Like the idea is to continue to progress in one aspect or the other, not necessarily pigeonholing yourself to the three lifts. You said people don't PR forever, but I think Anthony Harris and guys like that would argue otherwise. Those guys
Oh,
are
man.
incredible to watch.
Very inspirational folks. Tony's such a good dude too. Tony and Dave, man, that's one of the things I really miss about going to competitions is running into
Yeah.
guys like Tony and Dave, because they're just good people,
Yeah, I met Anthony in Oregon. He comes down every now and then to train when he's out of Hawaii, and one of
Yeah.
the nicest guys I've ever met. And the fact that he's squatting over 800 pounds at 50 something years old is
Right.
unbelievable.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I noticed that too with my career as far as a lifter goes. Like every time I would hit a 2,000 pound total, I would get a ton of clients, and then it would kind of fade until the next competition. And it's like, how can I make this an actual career? Because you can't base it solely off of your athletic endeavors, because it'll eventually fade. And then if that's all you're known for, people are going to wait for your next meet to hire you to see if you actually know what you're doing. So it definitely makes sense to shift to more of an educational perspective. Plus, that's something that you can do long term, right? And then you've evolved from that to grow in the business to where you can continue to pull yourself away from it if need be. And I've realized that too. Like I opened up my first gym and I was the head trainer there and I was the head instructor. And then as soon as I tried to pull away from it and like bring other people in to take my spot, it was just something that was met with a lot of resistance because I was always there. So a lot of really keen business strategies in terms of what you did, just kind of scratching the surface. But we just finished up a 4-week kind of conversation, myself and Paul, on periodization and breaking it down and looking at the research and stuff like that. And when you look at the research and the conceptual ideas of periodization, it's based in large part by the GAS, general adaptation syndrome, by Hans Selye. In order to improve, you have to train. And then from that training perspective, you go into the alert phase, and then you have to go back down and degress in order for you to progress again. And it's a very fixed binary kind of way to deal with stress. It doesn't take in the biology, it doesn't take in the psychosocial, psycho-emotional aspect of things. And then I've recently heard you talk to John Kiley and Mike Zordos and Eric Helms and on the Iron Culture podcast, going over kind of the conceptual ideas of how periodization has evolved, and you coming up with emergent strategies, kind of leading the forefront on that. But before we get into the emergent strategies, you came up with the RPE system for powerlifting when everything was mostly based on percentage type training for the longest time, kind of evolving from the West Side conjugate or the linear periodization models into an RPE based template. What within your own training, is that something that you came to realize would be the best approach, or is that something that you saw within the literature as well? Because I believe there wasn't much literature on RPE for strength training when you started coming out with it. It was mostly based on aerobic endurance. So how did you come to the forefront of like RPE auto-regulation and kind of getting away from that periodization model?
Yeah, there was none that I'm aware of. I'm pretty sure there was just none. So kind of your characterization of it as like being mostly percentage based is correct. And like for other supplemental movements, it was just like, okay, train failure. And uh, I remember there being some conversations um, like on message boards and whatnot at the time, like, hey, your rep work, your dumbbell benches and stuff like that, you don't actually have to take that stuff to failure. Like you could stop a rep or two short of failure, and you're still gonna, and that was kind of groundbreaking for a lot of dudes at the time. Like, wait,
Oh yeah.
you mean I don't have to actually make my eyes bleed on some reverse hypers to see some results from that? And so I remember kind of coming into contact with that idea, and then also reading about RPE from super training, which, as you mentioned, was uh, more focused around endurance. But I mean, it is framed in kind of this general way, like 10 RPEs as hard as you can go, and 9 RPEs, like however they termed it, is like a very heavy effort, and then not 8 RPE is a heavy effort, and then and so on down the line. It was just really vague language around it, and I thought, like, man, if you combine these two ideas, of kind of having a 1 to 10 scale of difficulty, and then also this idea of like, well, you could leave a rep in the tank, you could also leave 2 reps in the tank, you could, and so on. Well, that seems like a way to implement it that would give you more flexibility, that and then from there, you start to notice certain things like percentages. 85% for a set of 3 is going to have a certain RPE tied to it, and it does vary from lifter to lifter or lift to lift, but it's something that you can figure out. And so that's kind of how we got started on that. And at the time too, I was pretty focused on this idea of um, auto-regulation. I still am. I mean, that's probably the defining feature of my powerlifting career. But we, it was all about like kind of learning how to listen to your body. And everyone would talk about this, and it was just kind of taken for granted that that's what you need to do. But then when you get to the level of, okay, well, how do I do that? Well, you just got to train for a long time and figure it out. Well,
Right.
okay, fine, fair enough. But is there a way that we can even speed this up? So like a lot of my process was like, well, let's look and see what very strong, very experienced lifters do, try to understand that, and see if there's a way to export that thinking to people with less experience and less time in the bar. So RPE was a way to do that. It's a thing that I think a lot of experienced lifters were doing anyway. Is just now it was like verbally articulated, and you can follow along. Before it was just something that they just kind of did. You just kind of knew when you were writing your program that, hey, if we're training 85%, probably don't want to be running that for sets of 5, 6 reps. That's gonna, it's gonna be pushing things harder than I want to. And or then, like, if you do get into the gym and you're lifting the planned weight calls for, I don't know, 200 kilos, and you put 200 kilos in the bar and you start lifting it, and it's moving better than it should, then you may throw on a couple extra kilos or something like that. The process for doing that was vague, and it could be vague because it was reliant on that experience. But if you've got somebody who's only been lifting for 5 years, then they don't have that, or worse, they might think they do, but really don't. And we see variability in decision making too. Some people make good decisions, some people don't. So if we can kind of figure out how to bring that more into like the I don't know, I guess a more articulated form, then we can measure it, we can kind of compare different methods of doing it. So I think RPE kind of became that tool.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When it comes to like subjective feedback markers like that, right? And you're trying to quantify it for the lifter, you can get a lot of kickback. I get a lot of kickback where people are so used to percentages that if they don't have it, they'll go into the gym and they're like, all I know how to do is either go really, really light or go really, really heavy. It's like, I don't know how to in between and intermediate it. What have you found to be some other markers that are allowing you to quantify this RPE scale? I know you're doing stuff with velocity-based training. I know there's some research that is kind of equating velocity-based training with RPE, and bar speed is kind of the biggest determinant of RPE, a little bit more so than how it feels now. So how are you trying to quantify that for your athletes so that it's a very much a holistic approach of like, here's some actual data, and then how do you feel on top of that as well?
So I like data, of course, and so bar speed works well for me. I've been tracking bar speed and recording the results for, oh gosh, since like 2009. Bought one of like the old school Tendo units. I do think that it encompasses probably 80% of RPE, maybe more if we tune it correctly. The thing is, like, really doing a good job of tuning bar speed correctly can take a lot. Now,
Yeah.
I mean, in the age of smartphones and machine learning algorithms and stuff like that, then it's not impossible to do. But I like where I'm at right now is still like I'm doing that. Like I'm collecting the data, I'm building the velocity charts. I'm kind of deciding which velocity chart do we need to use. Like just for instance, the velocity chart for like low repetitions is slightly different than the velocity chart for really high repetitions. I mean, velocity is cool because it does give you a really big operating range. Like a 10 RPE rep, is going to be about the same velocity, whether we're talking about 1 rep or we're talking about 5 reps or even really to about 10 reps. But if we're talking about like 20 reps, it starts to not be quite the same anymore. Now, lots of powerlifters are like, well, I never do 20 reps. Fair enough. But if you do a series of, say, multiple easy sets of 5, like imagine doing like a set of 5 at like a 6 or 7 RPE, and you're doing multiple of those on a not obscene amount of rest, say 2 or 3 minutes rest, you'll accumulate fatigue, and those reps will start to feel harder, and they will be harder, but the velocity isn't quite showing it how you would like it to, So in that way, I think it's still useful to be fluent in RPE, to understand what you're feeling. But if we had the right tools, then velocity could be a really good stand-in for that. Like if you had the right tools, then the machine might know, yeah, this rep was faster, but we're operating on short rest intervals, and the volume's stacking up. So in this situation, the RPE is actually this other thing. But nobody's done that yet. It's just like conceptually, we can see how you might do that, but nobody's actually done it.
Yeah. Yeah. And also too, with like velocity devices, you don't really know, I don't know if the newer ones have any type of automation to them, but you don't really know where your velocity is at until after the set, right? I wish somebody would come up with a velocity device where you can like predetermine the velocity that you want to be in, or the range, and then you get one sound if you're in that velocity, then you get like a if you're out of that velocity. So then you can like start to cut it off instead of continuing to push the set. But that's kind of where the RPE and all that stuff comes into play. One of the before we get into some of the emergent strategies, periodization stuff, one of the questions I get a lot when it comes to RPE from athletes, if you give them an RPE range, or you give them an RPE of 8, they always ask, the first set feels like an 8, but the last set feels like a 9 to a 10, right? Which one should I go with lighter weight so the last set feels like an 8? How are you describing RPE usage to your clients with that fatigue paradigm in mind of where that can take them in a rate of perceived exertion?
So to me, a lot of that depends on your training strategy. Whenever we get into training strategy, I've become a lot more, I guess, open-minded to things that can work in various situations. So lately, I've found myself programming a lot of repeats. So we'll work up to a certain rep RP combination for the first set, and we'll repeat that. And of course, the RPE goes up as fatigue sets in, and we're okay with that up to some threshold, but the threshold is usually pretty high, like a 9 RPE. And if it's like, look, if you get to a 9 RPE and you still have some work to do, then reduce the bar weight. Usually about 5% will do the trick, and finish your work. But to the extent possible, repeat the same weight. But that's a strategy. We also use a different strategy, load drops, where we'll kind of automatically drop that 5%, in a more upfront way. Really, even then, we'll still use percentages for certain things. Like I do view it like a tool, and it's like, what effect are we trying to create? I want you to do reps that are like this or like that, and it's the effect that we're after. So just a really recent addition that we've made to the RTS training log is we've got this live stats section where, as you're entering your training log data, it's calculating stuff like your estimated 1RM, your tonnage, your number of lifts and stuff like that. But we also are calculating something we've called stress index. And there's kind of 3 different components of stress index. There's your total stress, which, think of that like the difficulty of the workout, or it's somewhat related to like the recovery demand of that training session. But then we call it central stress. You can think of that like the heaviness of the training, and peripheral stress. You can think of that like something like the volume of the training, but like volume as tonnage has some problems as a calculation.
Right.
Peripheral stress tries to get around some of that, and tries to encompass more like the peripheral demand of that work. So like if you did a whole bunch of bodybuilding work, that's going to be a high peripheral stress workout. So I think the central peripheral paradigm is something that's helpful for understanding what your training effect is going to be. Look, if you're doing a lot of volume in the 70% range, your central is going to be low, peripheral is going to be high. If you're doing some really heavy work, that you're going to be more centrally demanded, less peripherally demanded. And we get that. Like anybody who's got some powerlifting experience is going to get that. But then what about these combinations? What if I work up to a single at an 8 RPE and then do some back off sets of 4 at 80%? Where does that leave my overall balance? Well, I mean, we can figure that out. And I think that that's a good way to think about the training effect that you're trying to create. So should I do repeat sets, or should I do a load drop? Or another thing I've been doing lately are these surf protocols where we work up to something, say set of 8 at like a 7 RPE, and we'll say, let's keep the weight the same, and just keep banging on 7 RPE ish, and we're going to let the reps fluctuate. So as fatigue sets in, the reps drop down, but you keep the RPE and the weight the same,
Okay.
So there's a bunch of different ways to you've got these different variables for like on a set to set basis. You've got the weight, how many reps you do, and the RPE, and we can control two of them, and the third one is going to float. Like if you control the weight and the reps, then the RPE is going to be whatever it is. You know, if you control the weight and the RPE, then the reps are going to vary. You know, and you can do any of those things. It just depends on what training effect you want to create. And I think that central peripheral paradigm is a useful way to kind of wrap your head around the training effects that you're trying to create.
I'm always fascinated by the way in which people manipulate variables of the training to look at, you know, okay, this is the outcome that I'm trying to achieve.
Yep.
These are the variables that I have at play. How do I manipulate these given the constraints of the individual to achieve this said outcome? And that also plays back into the fact that, like, you're also playing with the same, you know, deck of core knowledge that everyone else is, right? We've all read the same books. We've all you looked at the same studies, but there was something within, you know, the way your brain looked at this to say, hey, there's a problem here that, you know, a much more analytical approach can solve. But then you bring in this subjective metric that is going to kind of throw a wrench into things and demand more of the athlete. And that's one of the things that I love about RPE is that there's a huge element of autonomy and accountability with the training, right? You put it in the hands of the athlete and you say, hey, you need to be a good decision maker here. I'm going to guide you in the best way that I can and give you all the tools needed to make those decisions. But ultimately, you have to make those decisions. Have you, okay, I'm always curious as to, so all of these protocols that you've mentioned, how do you determine, number one, where to start? Is it like a kind of a process of elimination? You look at the athlete and what their needs are. And then from that protocol, using, I guess this would be a good segue into the emerging strategies conversation of, so this works for X amount of time. How do you know from one strategy how to transition to a different one or what to try next? Like, what are some variables that you're looking at in that instance?
Yeah, the place to start is always, I guess, a little bit tricky. You know, it's also, in the grand scheme of things, it's important, but not the most important thing. You know, in a professional coaching environment, it's important to kind of have some early successes and build trust with the athlete. But, you know, if you can get past that, then, you know, when you look back 5 years from now, you know, that first training block is just not going to be that important. You know,
Very true.
So, but I mean, still, you want to do the best you can. So we do kind of take a best guess approach because I mean, you don't know anything in the true sense of like having, you know, firsthand knowledge of how an athlete's going to respond. You just don't have much certainty in those early blocks. So you do what you think will work. Now, I find that coaches tend to develop their own kind of patterns. You know, like I certainly have mine.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, and that tends to be just fine place to start usually. You know, and you make adjustments. Some adjustments are obvious. You know, if the athlete is feeling like you're killing them with volume, then maybe back that down a little bit. Or you know, if you've selected some movement that's creating a problem, then you change it out. You know, so some things like that are obvious. The trick is kind of the process of optimization. You know, like how do we make each block better? How do we know what the lifter is responding well to? You know, what do we think we want to try next? You know, and in the beginning, it's pretty wide open territory. You know, like what do we try next? Well, what looks interesting? You know, we just did a volume block. Do you feel like doing another volume block? Do you feel like doing, you know, of course, another volume block that's slightly different? Or do you feel like doing something with more intensity? You know, and that informs a lot. And pretty much all stages of athlete development, I do place a high value on that kind of athlete intuition. I think there's a lot of this that probably comes back to, athlete engagement. And, if we're planning a block that they had some say in, that they want to, has some significant components of it that they actually want to do, then, we're going to get more engagement. They're going to be happier about it. And we're going to probably make more progress that way. But the whole time I'm collecting data, right? The athletes log into training, and then at the end of each block, I'm doing a block review, and we're saving all that stuff. And okay, hey, it's time to start preparing for this competition. We've got like 2 blocks before competition. So we go back through the block reviews and start trying to make sense of what we've learned, that, hey, when we do blocks that contain this exercise or are done at that intensity, we see really good results. And, these other things are not producing such good results, or not correlated with such good results. It's not establishing a guarantee, it's not a causal relationship. It's not proving that this is going to work, but it's the absolute best that we can do. Like, I don't know how far we want to go down the philosophy of science road, but there's just some things that are knowable, and then other things that are frankly not knowable. We just can't predict how an athlete is going to respond, but we can make this assumption that, hey, how you've responded in the past gives us a pretty good idea. And that seems like a reasonable assumption to make. So that's kind of the road that we go down. So we'll pull that stuff out of the block reviews, build a new block that's kind of the greatest hits for this athlete, and we'll play that for the last 2 blocks leading into a competition. And so far it's led. Let me put it this way: most of the time, you end up coming up with something that's customized, but within the world of what you would see in a traditional powerlifting planning approach. Most people respond better to high intensity than low intensity, and so the peaking looks somewhat normal. But occasionally, you run into somebody who responds in a fairly unorthodox way, and it can lead you to some pretty strange peaking strategies. But if it's strange and it works, then that's okay.
So to simplify for people, and this is something that we try to bring whenever we discuss programming, we discuss training, it comes back to, you make an educated guess, you look at the data that you're collecting along the way, you involve the athlete in the process as much as possible, and then when it comes to making adjustments, you use what's available to make the best guess at that point again, and then you're just continuing to iterate on that process for this athlete. That's I love that. I love that you said best guess at the beginning. I was worried it'd be some incredibly nebulous answer.
No, it's definitely a best guess. And I mean, there's value in really a best guess. It's not just a guess that we say is our best, right? But we do put, getting to be more and more effort into doing better with that.
Well, even that best guess is based on, I have this athlete. Of the thousands of athletes that I've coached in the past that could possibly resemble this athlete, I think this would fit best.
Right. Yeah. So it's kind of an evolutionary approach to programming, right? We're saying that, you start somewhere and then you're going to let the program evolve based on the athlete response. And I mean, I think that's the way that you have to go. But you're going to have an easier time of that evolution if you can start at a place of success, and you can evolve into more success and kind of evolve the pain points away. If you start at a position of a really ugly block, then you got a lot more work ahead of you.
Yeah. No, that makes a ton of sense. One of the things that you're talking about is the idea of finding the best strategies to work for that lifter for their given sport based on the blocks that they're doing, right? And powerlifting, the given sport is very easy to define, right? You have to do a single at squat, bench, and deadlift. So how often are you using singles within these blocks to lend you the thought of this is working, or how are you gauging that this is working, right? Because I know some people who can improve their volume numbers, but then when you get into the heavier weights, it doesn't have the same carryover. So how do you know that that volume block is actually improving their ability to generate that heavy single at a higher load? What are you looking at in some of those characteristics to kind of formulate best guess scenarios, best strategies moving forward?
I personally, and I think most of the RTS coaches like to program singles, usually single around an 8 RPE. So something a little bit heavier than an opener gives you a good idea of what you're capable of on a given day. It's reliable, it's repeatable, it's good skill practice. So I think there are tangible reasons to do it, but it also kind of serves as that benchmark. Like, hey, are we improving at the thing that we care about or not? Um, and we can do that pretty consistently. Um, in the beginning, I dabbled with like singles at like a 9 RPE, and you can do that. It definitely takes a certain type of person to do that, like week in and week out, and you need more frequent breaks from an approach like that than you do, say, singles at 8 RPE. We end up programming those in pretty often. Um, like you said, I think it helps us to keep in touch with what's the athlete actually responding to, what's working best. And yeah, I think that's a good way to go. Um, but we do notice that some people tend to get beat up from doing stuff like that. Um, some lifters just don't respond well to the heavier weights, the central stress. Um, so you've got to find strategies that avoid that, you know, or kind of find out like how much of this can we take? Like, oh, we can do 2 weeks of it before we start seeing the negative effects. Okay, well, let's get our 2 weeks in before the competition, just so we know where we're at, like brush up on the skill aspect of it, and then roll it, you know.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. With the people that you're seeing not have particular success with this type of single frequency, is that more of a biomechanical, morphological thing that you're seeing? Like maybe they're just not built for that lift, so it takes a little bit more out of them, or is that just something that in general that person recoverability doesn't lend itself to that from a more like chemical level?
A little bit of both.
Okay.
You know, there are a couple handful of examples that come to mind. One guy is one of John's clients who is a little bit more kind of lightly built in terms of joints, and smaller guy, lighter weight class. Um, he's also, I don't know exactly how old he is, but he's not a young guy, not like a 20 something, you know. So um, there's different considerations there, but you know, like I've coached other guys who are, you know, over 200 pounds, and you know, kind of almost the opposite of what I just described. You know, he's a heavier guy, um, more significantly built, much stronger, and you know, nationally competitive, but just did not respond well to heavy weights. And so in the first scenario, it does seem to be recovery related. It's like if you start pushing the central stress, the heavier weights too much, then first there's no progress, then there's pain and injury.
Yeah.
In the second scenario, I've talked about him quite a bit, Mike Barraza. Um, for him, we would start to push the heavier weights, and he could see some success with it for 2 weeks or something like that. But then, it's not the end of the block yet, and he starts to feel beat down, starts to get some aches and pains. So then the progress stops, and then it just kind of snowballs downhill from there. So kind of the order and the detail of kind of what's going on are different, but the end result is, more or less the same. Like, well, whatever it is, this intervention is not producing results for us. So let's find a different way to go.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense, especially thinking like old periodization models, right? Where you have to go through this block and then you have to go to the next block. And then maybe by the third block, you'll be able to see if all this work turned into a better single. The idea of including more specificity of the actual competition into your training paradigm, like that's going to be the biggest driver, right? Neural adaptations, one of the biggest drivers to strength, if not the biggest driver to strength. So how can we include that into their program as often as possible without getting them beaten down, whether it be from a psychological standpoint of heavy work or whether it be from a muscular or joints or anything like that. And then once you have that kind of paradigm of like, hey, he can do maybe 2 singles a week and then he get beat up. So we don't need to push it to 3, and then sometimes we can move it down to 1.
Yeah.
And you find that with each lifter, I think that can be something that is extremely valuable.
Well, that you're just describing there is vertical integration, Charlie Francis's vertical
Yep.
integration model. Yeah. So, and I mean, I think that's just on its face a smarter way to go about training in general than like a pure, Isherin style block periodization approach where, you go long periods of time pretty far away from competitive specific events. So Charlie's idea of keeping all components of the program present at all times and just varying the emphasis, that you may have like an accumulation block where you're still doing your high intensity something. It may not be every week, you may space it out a little bit more, it may not be quite as heavy, but it's still present in the program. And then that emphasis can shift, as you go through the blocks. Like that strikes me as intelligent. And I think, if I may be so bold as to suggest the next step forward there is just observance of athlete response and a willingness to adjust that block structure to the athlete response. I think kind of the idea of having all the components of the program present is complex training, by definition. So he's kind of espousing a slightly more complex approach, and that which I think is a good plan. And then we just need to change the order of those complex blocks based on what the athlete's responding best to. Most of the time, it's going to be what you think, because there's a reason why the typical powerlifting program is the typical powerlifting program, is because it works most of the time for most people.
Mm-hmm.
But the people who are the exceptions tend to care about that quite a bit.
Right. Yeah. Me and Paul talk about this a lot. You'll have some coaches and they'll have their kind of predisposed way they template everyone. And then, it'll work if they have 100 athletes, it'll work for maybe 40 of them, but the other 60, it doesn't work for, but you only know the 40 that they're talking about. So then you think they're a successful coach, whereas you're not creating a template for the athletes to fit into. You're having your athletes and then you're fitting your template and your thought and your years of experience into their paradigm, which is much better. Like it's an athlete centered approach instead of a program centered approach, which makes so much sense.
Absolutely. First of all, and I mean, that touches on something. This is kind of something I've been talking to our people about a lot lately. Is you mentioned kind of the biopsychosocial aspect of training. And I find that, man, there's a lot of baggage that people bring to a program like mine, that, and I definitely don't mean this like as a slight, but it's like, you'll imagine like you've got an athlete who, you've planned this training block for them, and they're in the middle of the block and it's going okay, but obviously there's too much volume. You've programmed in more volume than they're able to recover from. So you say, hey, in your next session, I want you to skip the last set, of each exercise. We're going to reduce the volume just a little bit, and help you get a little bit more recovery. Well, how do they feel about that? In my experience,
Right.
most athletes feel like a failure.
Yeah.
Like they're, that ain't it.
Right.
like,
Right.
like you had no control over this. Like your ability to recover is not something that you choose. Not really. I mean, we say like, yeah, get your sleep, get your nutrition. That stuff's important, but I don't think that really. Look, I think sleeping 8 hours versus sleeping 6 hours doesn't make you less sore. If you're sore, and you're going to be sore until you're not. And there's not a whole lot you can do about that. I think it's important to do those things from an adaptation standpoint, but it's not as much a recovery standpoint. Anyway, I'm kind of getting off topic. It's just that people feel some kind of way about those program adjustments. And so I was talking to somebody about this, and she goes, yeah, so what you're saying is that like these program adjustments are a feature, not a bug. And yeah, that's a good way to think of it. This is something that is here for you. You're not failing the program. You're not, failing to measure up to, my expectations or anything. If anything, it's the other way around. It's this program isn't tailored enough to your specific response. And I mean, the nature of humans being variable, your recovery isn't always the same. Your rate of progress isn't always the same. We're not going to be able to predict those things. So the next best thing is to be responsive, as responsive as we can be to those new bits of information. And, for that to work, you got to feel okay about it. Like, look, we're going to dial the volume down. This week is going to be kind of an easy week, so we can dissipate some of that fatigue that we stacked up that we didn't really mean to stack up. So, yeah, hey, these things happen. And it doesn't mean that you failed. And it also doesn't mean that the program is going to be any less effective. If anything, I find that stuff like that is more effective. The human body tends to thrive off of variability, variability in, training stress or doing the same thing over and over. Now, this sounds counter to the emerging strategy stuff, I know, but doing the same thing over and over is usually not the best way.
Right.
Now, how that fits into emerging strategies might be the same thing over and over for a little while,
Right. Yeah.
But as soon as that stops working, you change up and you do something else entirely.
It's almost like people want bonus points for like hard work. And they're like, oh, if I got to do the most amount of work possible, because the most amount of work is going to equal the most amount of progress. But the reality of the situation is if you look at those top performers, they're doing only what's required to make progress. And that's why they stay injury free. That's why they can perpetually make progress block to block.
I mean, look, man, I struggle with this, in my own training. Yeah. Oh man, like this notion of like, I have to be the hardest working guy in the room is baked in really deep, even though like I know that it's, yeah, look, you're going to have to work hard. That, yeah, of course, that's a thing. But your ability to work hard will definitely outstrip your ability to make progress. You can work harder than is good for you, because we put it that way. And as athletes, what we want is to make the best decisions. We've got to make good decisions so that we see the progress, and that's going to be working hard. That doesn't mean work until you die.
Right.
So there's some balance point to hit, and if you feel bad about yourself every time that you come up to that balance point, then just not ideal.
Right, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's the idea, right? Like we're told that volume is the biggest driver of adaptation. So we think if you're getting your volume pulled back, you're falling behind. Like
Right.
you're a failed system. And
Yeah.
I was listening to a podcast with Brian Cushing, who played in the NFL, played for the Houston Texans, one of the best linebackers in the game. And he was known for his like work ethic. And on the podcast, he was like, yeah, my work ethic got me into the NFL, but it probably also took 3 to 4 years off my career because I just wouldn't ever train smarter. I would just always train as hard as I could.
Yeah.
And it's that idea of, right, like the athlete thinks that, and they've been told that whatever we give you, you'll eventually adapt to, right? It just takes an adaptation period. And it's like, well, no, you can't magically, if your recovery volume is set at say 18 sets a week, you can't sleep, eat, and change your genetic profile so that you can recover from 24 sets a week, right? That's just not
Right.
going to happen, right? How can you maximize the most out of your God-given ability for what you have? And I think that is what a lot of people have a hard time with, right? They have a hard time understanding that this isn't just a effort-based sport. It's also genetics. It's all, and if you can't come to realize your genetics may be inferior, but you can still progress a lot and you can still be the best you can be. You just may not be able to do the volume that we thought you could do, right? It's not on you. And how can we progress with what we have? And I think that that's something that's extremely important.
Well, I mean, you said it already. There are plenty of people who've gotten really strong in the sport by not doing the most.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's other people who are certainly volume responders, and
Right.
I think that there's just, it's one of these relationships that should work, right? Like the more you work, the more you should get out of it. But
Oh, yeah.
reality, it's just not that way, you know. And I remember, like, this was years ago, like before I was quite so sure of the things that I'm saying now, I think. But kind of having one of these conversations with somebody, and they said, wait, so what you're saying is like you could do less work and get more gains? And I remember like really being kind of taken aback by that. Like, well, yeah, obviously, you know, like if you think about it, like if more work can't always lead to more gains, otherwise, why would you ever leave the gym? You would just train until death. You know,
Right.
so
Train until death. How Bulgarian of you.
there's a t-shirt there for somebody. But yeah, so obviously, and why would you think that threshold happens at like 5 sessions a week, or you know, 15 or 18 hours of training a week or something like that? Like for a lot of people, it's not that way, you know?
Right. Yeah. And I love the one thing that you touched on a little bit earlier is the Charlie Francis model, right? And being able to integrate what other great coaches in different sports are doing within powerlifting. Every time I talk to a coach and their reference points are Russian techs front and that's it. And it's just purely weightlifting basis. I'm like, man, you're missing out on so many other things, right? Because, you know, one, you're never going to get the full picture if you're just reading those texts because you just don't know. And then two, right, if we can get stronger and better adaptations from coaches that are thinking about a highly more variable demands of aerobic system, anaerobic system, strength training, and all this other stuff, right? Why wouldn't we just start pulling from them? Why wouldn't we learn from those type of guys who are dealing with a lot more stress variables? So they're kind of figuring it out. One thing we talk about a lot is like, if you're dealing with an enhanced lifter, you can get away with a lot of shitty programming because the drugs are going to make up for it. But all the natural coaches seem to like have that next level because they have to be more precise with everything. They have to look at everything because they can't rely on the drugs. So I always try to find those coaches that are able to do things, you know, with a more holistic approach of taking in all the dynamics and not being over reliant on just the Russian literature, just performance speed, like all that stuff. Right. And
Yeah.
I think that's an important model to think about, right? It's like Charlie Francis had some great ideas for track and field that has been able to be correlated over to strength training with wide degrees of success. So why wouldn't you do that? It's like I do jujitsu now, and for the longest time, jiu-jitsu was thought about as, you know, upper body moves, triangle chokes, arm bars. And then Dean Lister came around and he's like, why would you neglect 50% of the body? Why wouldn't you ever go for the legs? Why wouldn't you go for the knees, right? As a coach, it's like, why would you only preclude yourself to Russian text or what Louis Simmons told you to read, or, you know, whatever, right? Like, why wouldn't you explore all these other variables if coaching is what you truly love to do? So I appreciate that you said the Charlie Francis model and you go into those realms of things.
Yeah, thanks. If I had to guess, I would bet that the jiu-jitsu stuff that you're doing gives you some perspective or gives you some idea about powerlifting training, and it may not be direct, you know,
right?
But it's like I don't know. I had a class in college where they were talking about stuff like this. They were talking about. I remember we used lots of different examples, but like even like a piano performance or something like that, and you needed a certain amount of requisite variety to get, I guess, to more like creative solutions, right? That you need to, you know, come into contact with things that are not just very narrowly like right here in my realm, you know, like the more breadth of things that you can come into contact with, the more likely you are to be able to pull something or make some connection that, you know, you hadn't seen before, or maybe that nobody has seen before. And it may not be like direct, like, well, I learned this doing jujitsu and now I'm going to apply it to powerlifting. It doesn't have to be that way. It can be a lot more, you know, nebulous, maybe operating in the background even, you know, but I think that stuff is really important.
Even in our conversation today, we've touched on the fact that we're involving, you know, biology, we're involving sports science, we're involving psychology, we're involving communication strategies. Like all of these things play a role. We're talking about stress management and lifestyle, like everything, like that holistic aspect, as Tony mentioned, of this is a person who exists in the world in some unique capacity, and we need to adjust our approach for them and how they're responding to whatever intervention that we're putting forth for them. Like, I think like that simplistic of that simple explanation of this massively complex system.
Yeah.
And then just how do you manipulate that? So you've developed your system, and I mean, even you're implementing data science now. We're gathering all this, you know, central stress, peripheral stress, providing a stress index. I guarantee we're going to be seeing you use that in some form of, you know, new intervention or something like that to kind of revolutionize and provide a ton more accuracy to your approach, right? To make that decision-making process more repeatable.
It definitely grows and snowballs, you know, but
sure.
You know, it's like, you know, like the stress index thing started as how do we compare like workloads at different intensities, you know, because volume doesn't really work, number of lifts doesn't really work, you know, so stress index kind of starts there, but then, you know, as time goes on and that tool develops, you start to see other potential uses for it. Like, oh, wait, can I regulate my workload based on this? Like, what happens if I compare this to, you know, a baseline and different things? So I think there's like an evolution of solutions as well. So yeah, just kind of getting into it and getting your hands dirty, I think, is a good way to come up with unique things as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think what you're doing there with the stress and the nervous system type stuff, I think that is like the next step for coaches, right? Because if you look at the literature on fatigue and fatigue mechanisms and things like that, you'll notice that a lot of the fatigue is acute in nature, right? It's, you know, central nervous system tends to rebound 4 to 8 hours after a training session. Delayed onset muscle soreness, 24 to 48 hours. People can seem to recover in 48 hours from almost anything. But why does that accumulation stack on to where they actually need to deload, right? And that's going to be from the psychological side of things. That's going to be from the mental side of things, right?
Yeah.
It could be the monotony of the program. It could be the effort that the person has to put into it every single day. It's not what I would, based on the literature and from what I've seen, it's never the muscles. It's never right. It's how we perceive those training sessions that start to accumulate. That will be that wear and tear, right? So if you can monitor that through stress mechanisms, through fatigue index, through central nervous system, that's going to lend itself to giving you better results on your recoverability than the idea of muscle soreness or acute bouts of training, right? It's like the chronic adaptation or the acute adaptations over time lead into chronic stress. And that's what you need to recover from. Are you, with that in mind, are you doing anything to end your sessions? Because some of the research that I've read is how you end things, right? Like Daniel Kahneman talks about the remembering self versus, and how you remember the situation is going to lend itself to how you perform the next time. So are you doing anything to end your session to where that athlete's leaving that session feeling better than they came into it, so that they're mentally ready for the next one? Are you thinking about any type of mental type of recovery strategies or parasympathetic recovery post-training to lend themselves to having better index scores and things like that? Are you doing any of that type of stuff?
Not directly, not like from a training intervention standpoint, but I do think it's Gillian Pinot talks about stacking up wins. And I think that's really important as well. I think it's probably worth just taking a few minutes after your training session. I think it's something a lot of people do naturally anyway, but take a few minutes after your training session and think like, what were my wins today? You know, some sessions it's easy to find, and then other sessions you got to look a little bit harder. But you know, kind of, I guess it's like the powerlifter's version of a gratitude journal or something like that.
Yeah.
But that stuff is important, and like I find that if we're doing something where we're stacking up these wins, then it's hard to say like where the what direction the causal arrow is pointing in, right? Are the wins helping us to achieve success, or is the success making the wins easier to see? Who knows? But you know, it's an indicator that you're going in the right direction at least.
Right.
You know, so yeah, I think creating those wins, helping the athlete to create those wins is important as well. You know, if for no other reason, it helps to maintain engagement. And like, why do we need to change the exercises or change the protocols that a lifter is doing? You know, like if in a emergent strategies context, I'm changing them block to block or something like that. Why? From a purely biological standpoint, you know, we don't know of any mechanism that, you know, hey, you've done floor press for a block or 2 blocks already, so you're no longer going to adapt to that. We don't know of a mechanism for that, although I don't know, it sure seems like there must be something there.
Yeah,
anyway,
that's for sure.
Anyway, even it could be, I guess, psychological, but to put that aside for a minute, like if it's hard for the athlete to see the wins in that because they've been doing it for a while, they're not seeing much progress and they're kind of lifting the same weights over and over each week. It's hard to see the wins there. So, okay, let's change it out for something else. Engagement will be higher if nothing else. And we know that, you know, a more engaged athlete is better off.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Paul, do you have any other questions before we end?
A bit of a selfish question. So we chatted at the beginning about how you started gaining momentum as a coach and a business owner through your own competition. And this is actually something that I recently chatted with Bryce about, because Bryce and I are buddies. We used to train together all the time. And I asked him one day, I'm like, you think if you stopped competing right now, you could still run your business? And he's like, I think I might be there. And this is from a guy who's like 40,000 YouTube followers, or probably more at this point. hundreds of clients across the world. And I'm kind of at this point personally, and I think some coaches are going to be there too, where we get into training and competing to see how strong we can get. So I just want to get as strong as I possibly can. And I'm confronted almost weekly with this notion that I think I might have found it. So at this point, I'm transitioning in my career of coaching, coach's corner, building out, these areas in which I feel I can still make a tremendous amount of progress and impact on the world. You stepped away for quite some time. Like I started following you again, just like Tony, when you were making those videos with Super Training and Mark, and I was like, man, this guy's fucking strong. And he talks about training in a different way. I need to learn from him. So, I bought your book and all that stuff, and you stepped away for quite some time, and it looks like you're starting to ramp things up. Are you like, what's going through your head at this point? I'm curious, so curious.
I would like to get back on the platform, but I mean, talk about like feeling conflicted. I'm there. The powerlifting has definitely not missed me, I would say, like on the platform. Like powerlifters have gotten freaking strong, man.
Oh yeah.
And for a while I was thinking like, yeah, the 120 class hasn't really moved on, but it's moved on. Like Dennis has always been Dennis, but
Right.
it's not just Dennis anymore. There's lots of really strong dudes, and even in my own backyard, so like it wouldn't be it's not just like this open and shut thing that, oh yeah, I can get back on the platform and kind of
Yeah, totally with you right there.
So I don't know. I mean, right now I'm just squatting. I haven't decided to reintroduce deadlifting yet. Mostly because there's just not space in the program. I've got kind of lodged in my brain this goal of doing a 600-pound front squat, and so
Same.
I'm like fixated on that right now. So if I can do that, then I'll be able to kind of back burner some of the front squats, and I'll add in deadlifts. But for right now, it's like there's only space for squatting, and I'm doing some more reppy stuff at that. The rep stuff has been going well, which it does get the little voice in the back of my head going like, hey, you gotta start angling back toward a competition. But man, that's a long way off. And if I were to start ramping things back up, and it, like say if I started getting the same hip pain come back, it just isn't worth it to me at this point to push through that. Like I said, the thing that I find that I care about the most is kind of finding, picking a challenge. Like right now it's front squats and bench press, and see if I can figure that out. Like, how do I push that a little bit further? That's interesting to me. And if I can kind of transition that back to the power lifts, I think that would be cool. Then you've got this other problem with like, would you want to come back to the platform and total, 100 kilos less than your best? Like, does that say anything? Does that mean anything? I mean, truth is, I probably worry about that stuff way more than anyone else would.
Same.
Probably nobody else cares that much. People tend to be pretty focused on their own stuff.
Yeah.
And
I've thought about. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I don't know. I'm just kind of rambling on about that.
Well, I've started like picking challenges, like, oh, I want to front squat 600, or I want to do, X lift for X amount of reps. And then again, with the rep stuff, I get reminded, I'm like, oh, okay, like I'm still kind of strong still. Like I tied a rep PR on my squat, and my knees don't hurt. But I'm at a point now where I'm like, for the first time in 5 years, nothing hurts. And I'm able to make progress. And I'm like, do I want to risk something hurting just so I can step on the platform and then not enjoy training again?
Yes. Man,
that's exactly where I'm at.
That was the biggest thing for me, is like, because I fought with it for like 2 years, doing a block and it would hurt, and then take some time off and then go away, but then it would come back again. it's really kind of bad this session. How can I, what if I change my stance, and like, it's affecting your bar speed and all this stuff. And you don't ever feel like you're able to really open the throttle and push things, which is what most of us like. Man, when I stopped doing that and I said, I'm gonna find some things that I can care about that don't hurt, and I'm gonna focus on that for a while. And training got to be so fun again.
Yeah.
I was like, this is what I like. This is just enjoyable. It's not a chore to go in and train because it's gonna hurt for 2 hours.
Yeah. That's so important, right? The pain mitigates the fun in almost anything, right? And if you're not able to push it and feel young again, so to speak, right, then it just takes a lot out of you. So I can definitely agree with that. That's why I don't powerlift anymore, and I do wrestle in pajamas and stuff.
Well, I know we're kind of winding it down here, but just maybe something to leave you guys to think about is, what is it then? Like, what is it that we're finding enjoyable about that? What is it that's meaningful about it? Because pain avoidance is pretty self-explanatory. Like that training that hurts sucks, and we don't need a whole lot more explanation than that. But then, so you train and you push through the pain for a long time, and then you stop doing that, and you go, like I said, for me, the joy came back. Like, what is that? Like, what's causing that? And I think if you can get closer to figuring out what that is, it's more than just competing in powerlifting. Like, I would want people to, Paul, like what you're saying is like finding other challenges that mean something to you. That I think that's cool, and I want other people to be able to do that too. Like, look, if you can train and compete in powerlifting, then awesome, let's do it. If you get to the point where that's not really a thing, that maybe needs to come off the table, it would be better for you if you didn't. Then there's still more meaning to be extracted here.
100%.
Yeah. I can't quite articulate what that is, but it's there. You guys see it, I see it. So
I'm gonna do it. I registered for 2 meets this year, so
all right.
I can't see. Now that I have Tony talking shit to me every week, I can't just rest on the fact that my Wilks is 1 point higher than his.
Okay.
I have to out-total him. It's gonna happen, big guy.
I hope it does, man. I hope it does. Yeah, I think, I don't know what it is that you're finding that in training and in life, I think is very valuable, and being able to push yourself in something, I think is very valuable, right? I think I talked to Paul about this a lot. I served in the military, and I was able to do some fun stuff and push myself to the limit. And then you live your whole life trying to create a better life for yourself and an easier life. And then you miss that struggle and that adversity. So how can you implement that into your life to somewhat feel alive again, right? And it's like these challenges of doing these things, right? For me, it's not so much lifting based anymore. It's like jujitsu and maybe some endurance stuff, like things that I'm just not typically prone to do, but mentally is very, very challenging for me. For you, it's a 600-pound front squat, right? Those are the things that we can look forward to in a very comfortable and easy life that challenge us without deteriorating our quality of life. And those challenges that do that are the things that, for me, is what's extremely valuable as far as like learning more about yourself. And it's extremely valuable in being able to handle adversity when it does come your way, right? If the hardest thing in my day is in the gym training, then I have a pretty good life, and I can look back on that and think like, man, this is not bad, right? This is enjoyable. But once you hit those thresholds of, things pulling away from that and taking away from that joy that you had, then you start to think, well, what is going to challenge me now? What is there? My life's so easy. Now I have this thing that's taken away from the thing that challenged me. Now now what, right? And yeah, what you're looking for in terms of how to put that into words, if somebody can do that, that would be amazing. But yeah,
Right.
that path is fun, man, and it never ends, and it shouldn't end. But the quote is, what, we don't grow old because we play, we grow old because we stop playing, or something along those lines. I think that's extremely valuable to find, whether it's from a powerlifting perspective or any sport in general, right? Play as much as you can and enjoy it, but push yourself and try to find hard things to do.
Yeah. Right. Well said.
All right. So Mike, appreciate your time, man. If you guys are interested to learn more about Mike and what he has going on, Reactive Training Systems is his company. They also have a free training log, if I'm correct, right? You guys have a free training log that people can.
On the RTS website, reactivetrainingsystems.com. If you log in and click on apps, then you're pretty much there. You can log your training. You can run block reviews on your training. The whole thing is oriented to help you make better training decisions. And that's there. It's free for anybody to use.
That's awesome, man. You're doing so much for the community. We appreciate everything that you do. You guys can also check out their YouTube. They have a podcast, all that stuff. And then you guys, I know you were doing educational workshops, and I know you're doing a lot of online educational stuff too. Are those courses that are intermittently throughout the year, or is that anyone can sign up at any time?
Well, actually, this is the first time I'll be talking about this, but we just restructured all that stuff so that now it's available on demand.
Awesome.
So anytime anybody wants to jump into that, they can. They'll have access to all the lessons. You can watch them as fast or as slow as you want, whatever suits you.
That's perfect. I cannot recommend that type of stuff enough. And Mike also has a book as well, which you'll probably say is a little outdated, but it's still a great book to pick up and read. But if you guys are more interested in the stuff that he's working on now with his team, check out those webinar-ish type of scenario. So Mike, appreciate your time, man. It was a great conversation. We really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for the work that you do for the community and for challenging us to get out of our bubbles and think outside the box a lot more, man. You're one of those creative thinkers that always makes me question what I'm doing, which I greatly appreciate. There's not enough guys like you. So thank you so much, sir.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. Good chatting with you guys.
Thank you.